The unexpected visit. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon in Brookshire Heights, an affluent suburb lined with pristine houses, sprawling lawns, and luxury cars. In this neighborhood, where elegance and wealth were the norms, the Johnson family stood out, but not because they lacked wealth. They had the means to be there. Michael Johnson, the father, was a self-made entrepreneur who had built a successful tech consulting firm from the ground up. He had worked tirelessly for years, often to the point of exhaustion, to provide his family with a life that defied the odds stacked against them. His wife, Evelyn, was the heart of the family. A former teacher turned non-profit advocate, she had a gentle strength that anchored Michael and their two children, Jordan and Leah. Jordan, their teenage son, was 15, a smart, thoughtful young man with ambitions of studying law. Leah, only 8, was a bright and inquisitive child who still found joy in the little things, even when the world around her seemed complicated. Today, Michael had decided to treat his family to a special dinner. It wasn't just any restaurant. Le Chateau d'Or, a high-end French restaurant known for its exclusivity and celebrity clientele. It was nestled in the heart of Brookshire Heights and frequented mostly by the upper crust of society, people who had been raised in wealth, people who rarely encountered families like the Johnsons. Despite their financial success, the Johnsons were well aware that wealth didn't automatically grant them access to every space, especially in a predominantly white neighborhood like this. Past experiences had taught them that their skin color often invited unwarranted scrutiny and prejudice. Yet, Michael felt a sense of pride in showing his children that they belonged anywhere, regardless of societal biases. As they pulled up in their sleek SUV, Michael took a deep breath. He could feel the quiet tension in the car. Evelyn, seated beside him, glanced over, sensing his nerves. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly. Michael looked at her and nodded. "Yeah, we deserve this. They need to see that we're not afraid to take up space." Jordan, sitting in the back seat, overheard the conversation and looked out the window, taking in the scene. The restaurant's elegant entrance, flanked by valet attendants and luxury cars, felt imposing. Leah, ever the optimist, piped up with a grin. "Can we get dessert, Daddy?" she asked, oblivious to the undercurrent of unease. Michael chuckled, grateful for her innocence. "Of course, sweetheart." The family stepped out of the car and made their way to the restaurant entrance. Heads turned almost immediately. The patrons who had been enjoying their cocktails on the terrace glanced up, their eyes lingering a bit too long. Whispers began to rise from nearby tables, accompanied by subtle but unmistakable glances. The Johnsons were used to this. They had felt this type of attention before, subtle, quiet, but heavy with judgment. Still, they carried themselves with dignity. Michael opened the door for his family, and they stepped into the opulent interior of Le Chateau d'Or. The restaurant's decor was impeccable, gleaming marble floors, chandeliers that cast a soft golden light, and waitstaff dressed in crisp black uniforms. A grand piano played softly in the corner, adding to the luxurious ambience. At the entrance stood a hostess, tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored black dress, her smile faltering ever so slightly as her eyes fell on the Johnsons. For a moment she hesitated, her gaze flickering between the reservation list and the family in front of her. There was a slight pause, just long enough for Michael and Evelyn to exchange a knowing glance. "Good evening," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. "We have a reservation under Johnson." The hostess's smile tightened. "Ah, yes, Mr. Johnson. One moment, please." The seconds stretched as she scrolled through the list, seemingly taking longer than necessary. Her discomfort was palpable, and Michael could feel the eyes of other patrons on them, watching, waiting. Finally, the hostess spoke. "Your table is ready. Follow me, please." She led them through the dining room, where the stares intensified. Conversations quieted as they passed by tables filled with affluent diners, mostly older, mostly white. Some of them exchanged hushed whispers, while others simply stared, their eyes betraying a mixture of surprise, curiosity, and discomfort. "Leah," unaware of the tension, swung her hand in her mother's as they walked. Jordan, however, wasn't so oblivious. He could feel the weight of every stare, every whisper, and it made his skin prickle with anger. He clenched his fists, but his father's calm demeanor kept him grounded. Michael had taught him the importance of grace under pressure, of not letting others define who you are or what you're worth. The hostess finally stopped at a table near the center of the room, conspicuously away from the windows or any of the more desirable seating areas. Michael raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Evelyn gave him a gentle squeeze on the arm, a silent reminder to let it go. "Your server will be with you shortly," the hostess said before swiftly walking away, leaving the family to settle in. As they sat down, the tension remained thick. The other patrons continued to steal glances, some more discreet than others. The Johnson family, however, kept their composure. They had dealt with this kind of behavior their entire lives. Polite society's version of exclusion, wrapped in whispered judgments and awkward silences. Michael glanced around the room and then at his family. "This is nice, isn't it?" he said, forcing a smile. Evelyn nodded, her smile tight but genuine. "It's beautiful." Jordan, unable to contain his frustration, leaned in. "Why are they staring at us? They act like they've never seen black people before." Michael sighed. "They're just curious. Don't let it bother you." "Curious?" Jordan scoffed. "It's more than that, Dad. They don't want us here." Before Michael could respond, the waiter arrived, stiff, professional, but avoiding eye contact. His tone was cold, and he seemed to rush through the explanation of the menu, as if he couldn't wait to move on to his next table. Michael remained composed, though he felt the sting of the poor treatment. As the waiter left, the family exchanged glances. They knew what was happening, but they had made a decision the moment they walked in. They weren't going to let this ruin their night. Leah, sensing the tension, tried to lighten the mood. "I think I'm going to order something fancy, like escargot." The family chuckled, the light moment easing the tension. But even as they tried to focus on enjoying the evening, the whispers, the stares, and the subtle acts of exclusion continued. The Johnsons held their heads high, but the weight of the evening was beginning to settle on their shoulders. And the night had only just begun. The family's resilience. As the evening stretched on, the air in the restaurant felt heavier. Michael Johnson, though composed on the outside, couldn't help but feel the weight of the stares. Sitting at the table with his wife and children, his thoughts drifted back to his early years, memories of struggle and determination surfacing like waves against the calm exterior he now presented. Michael's reflections. Michael had grown up in a small, modest home in a rough neighborhood. His father, a factory worker, had instilled in him the importance of hard work and self-reliance, but opportunities had always seemed limited. The world wasn't designed to open doors for boys like him. Still, he had been determined to break the cycle of poverty. Through sheer willpower and endless nights of studying, he managed to secure a scholarship to college, where he majored in computer science. There were days when Michael felt like an outsider even in his professional life, working twice as hard to prove his worth in an industry dominated by faces that didn't look like his. Yet, through perseverance, he had not only succeeded but thrived, building his own consulting firm from scratch. He had wanted his success to mean more than financial security. It was about showing his children that no matter where they came from, they could carve out a space in any room, in any world. Tonight, however, sitting in this restaurant, it seemed that no matter how much wealth or success he achieved, he would never fully escape the judgments. The realization stung, but he wasn't going to let it show. Michael looked at his family. He was proud of the life they had built together, of the strong, resilient children they were raising. But tonight, he felt a familiar anger rise within him. The same anger he'd felt as a young man being told that certain doors were closed to him. Only now, the stakes were higher because his children were watching. He had to make a choice, fight the anger or let it show. Evelyn's thoughts. Evelyn, meanwhile, sat beside Michael, her hand resting on Leah's, her heart heavy but calm. She was used to this. As a black woman, she had faced her share of discrimination, both subtle and overt, her entire life. From being followed in stores to being overlooked for job promotions she was more than qualified for, Evelyn had long since accepted that the world would never fully welcome her. But she had also vowed that she would not let it break her. She looked across the table at Jordan, her teenage son. His jaw was clenched, his eyes darting around the restaurant, clearly upset by the way they were being treated. Evelyn's heart ached for him. He was at an age where he was beginning to understand the complexities of the world, but he didn't yet have the experience to handle it with the grace that Michael did. She feared what these experiences were teaching him about his place in the world. And then there was Leah, her sweet, innocent Leah. Too young to fully grasp what was happening, Lee simply sat there, her face lit with curiosity, her little fingers tracing the silverware. Evelyn knew it was only a matter of time before her daughter would also face the harsh truths of the world. But for now, Evelyn wanted to protect that innocence, to show her that they belonged here just as much as anyone else. Leaving wasn't an option, not tonight. They couldn't show their children that they could be pushed out of spaces they had every right to be in. Michael caught her eye and gave her a small, reassuring nod. They were on the same page. They would stay, not just for themselves, but for their children. They would set an example of resilience, of pride, of dignity in the face of adversity. The kid's perspective. Jordan, on the other hand, wasn't feeling as calm. He stared at his plate, his appetite gone, his fists clenched under the table. He could feel the eyes on him, could hear the whispers coming from the nearby tables. Every now and then, he would glance up to see people turning their heads quickly, pretending they hadn't been staring. It made his skin crawl. "They don't want us here," he muttered under his breath, barely loud enough for his parents to hear. Michael turned to him, his voice calm but firm. "It doesn't matter what they want. We belong here just as much as they do." Jordan wasn't convinced. How could his father sit there, so calm, when it was clear that they were unwanted? He felt the anger rising in his chest. Every fiber of his being wanted to stand up, to say something, to make them stop staring. But he didn't. He stayed quiet, out of respect for his parents, but the anger didn't leave him. Leah, on the other hand, didn't seem to notice the tension at all. She was more interested in the menu, her wide eyes scanning the fancy names of dishes she'd never heard of. "Daddy, what's foie gras?" she asked innocently. Michael smiled at her. "It's a kind of fancy meat, but I don't think you'd like it." Leah giggled, oblivious to the undercurrents around her. "I'm going to order something fancy too." Evelyn squeezed Leah's hand, grateful for her child's innocence in that moment. The family exchanged small smiles, quietly reassuring one another with a glance, a touch. The waiter's behavior. But the tension was soon broken when the waiter returned. He moved stiffly, his eyes never quite meeting theirs, his tone detached as he took their orders. The Johnsons had experienced this before, supper service, the kind that left a bitter aftertaste. The waiter barely listened to their requests, scribbling orders down with mechanical precision before walking off, without so much as a thank you. Jordan noticed it immediately, and his frustration deepened. "He's not even trying to hide it," he whispered angrily. "He doesn't care about us at all." Michael reached across the table and placed a hand on Jordan's arm, a silent signal to stay calm. He had long learned to let these moments slide, not because they didn't hurt, but because making a scene often made things worse. But Jordan was young, and to him, the injustice was glaring, intolerable. The nearby comment. Just as Jordan was calming down, a nearby family caught his attention. The man, sitting with his wife and 2 young children, leaned over to his wife, whispering loud enough for Jordan to hear. "What are they even doing here? They look so out of place." Jordan's body went rigid, his face flushed with anger as his mind raced. He couldn't let that go, he wouldn't. "Dad, did you hear that?" Jordan said, his voice rising. "They think we don't belong here." Michael's face remained calm, though his hand tightened ever so slightly on his glass of water. He had heard it, but he knew what would happen if they reacted. "Son, let it go," he said quietly, his voice steady. "But, let it go," Michael repeated firmly. "We're not here for them. We're here for us." Jordan sank back into his chair, but the frustration didn't leave him. Evelyn leaned over, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Don't give them that power, Jordan," she said gently. "We know who we are." The words hung in the air, their meaning clear. This wasn't just a dinner. This was a lesson, a moment where the family chose to rise above, to show their children that their worth wasn't dictated by the opinions of strangers. And so they continued their meal, the tension still there, but their resolve even stronger. The stares didn't stop, nor did the whispers, but the Johnsons sat with their heads held high, determined to finish their evening on their own terms. The night was far from over, but they weren't going anywhere, not tonight. A turn in the night. The tension at the table lingered like a heavy fog, wrapping itself around the Johnson family. Michael sat quietly, weighing his next move. He didn't want to ruin the evening for his family, especially for Leah, who had been so excited about this dinner. But the way they had been treated, the stares, the supper service, the whispered insults, it was too much. This wasn't the kind of example he wanted to set for his children, to just let it slide. Michael looked at Evelyn, who caught his gaze and gave a slight nod. She understood. There was no need for words between them. They had been through this too many times before. Michael raised his hand and motioned for the waiter to come over. "Yes, sir," the waiter asked, his voice still carrying that same aloofness. "I'd like to speak with the manager, please," Michael said calmly, his tone steady. The waiter blinked, seemingly taken aback, but nodded. "Of course, sir, I'll let him know." As the waiter walked away, Michael felt a surge of unease. He wasn't the kind of man who liked to cause a scene, but enough was enough. Jordan, who had been silently fuming, looked at his father with a mix of surprise and admiration. "They should know how they've been treating us," Jordan muttered. Evelyn gently placed a hand on her son's arm, silently reminding him to stay composed. A few minutes later, the restaurant manager approached. He was a tall, thin man in a perfectly tailored suit, with a forced smile plastered on his face. He stopped at the table, his hands clasped in front of him, and addressed Michael. "I understand you asked to speak with me. How can I help you, sir?" His tone was polite, but there was no warmth behind his words. Michael sat up straighter. "Yes, we've noticed the service tonight has been less than what we expected, especially given the reputation of this restaurant. We've been waiting for basic things like water refills and attentive service, and frankly, the atmosphere feels quite uncomfortable." The manager's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "I'm terribly sorry if you feel that way, sir. We strive to provide the best experience for all our guests. I assure you it wasn't intentional." It wasn't much of an apology, more like an attempt to brush the issue under the rug. The manager's eyes flicked briefly to the other patrons in the restaurant, as if to gauge their reactions. Michael could tell he was more concerned about maintaining the restaurant's image than addressing the problem. "I understand," Michael said, his voice still calm but firm. "But we've noticed how the staff has been treating us since we arrived. And it's not just us noticing, others are watching too." There was an awkward pause. The manager glanced around, clearly uncomfortable. "Again, sir, I apologize. We'll make sure you receive the proper service from now on." Before Michael could respond, a voice from the next table cut through the tension. "Is that really all you're going to say?" Michael turned his head to see an older, well-dressed gentleman sitting just a few tables away. He was impeccably put together, wearing an expensive suit with a pocket square and gold-rimmed glasses. His hair was a shock of silver, but his posture was strong, exuding an air of quiet authority. The manager looked flustered, clearly caught off guard. "Excuse me, sir." The older man stood up from his table and walked toward the Johnson family, his movements deliberate and poised. He nodded politely at Michael and Evelyn before turning his attention back to the manager. "I've been coming to this restaurant for years," the man said, his voice steady and commanding. "And I've never seen anything like this. These folks have been treated with blatant disrespect since they walked in, and it's not right." The manager looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. He opened his mouth to speak, but the older man cut him off. "I've seen this kind of behavior before," the man continued, now addressing the entire restaurant. "It's subtle, sure, microaggressions, they call it, but it's real. And just because you're not throwing someone out doesn't mean you're not making them feel unwelcome." By now, the other diners had fallen silent. Everyone was watching, some with surprise, others with discomfort. Whispers floated through the room, but no one interrupted. The gentleman turned back to the Johnsons. "I'm sorry you've had to experience this. I've been around long enough to know that money doesn't always change how people see you. But let me tell you, folks like you are just as deserving of respect as anyone else in this room, if not more." Michael felt a swell of gratitude, mixed with surprise. He hadn't expected anyone to intervene, much less an older white man. This was the last thing he saw coming. The man extended his hand. "Name's Robert Henderson. I've been a regular here for years. And what I just saw, unacceptable." Michael shook his hand, his grip firm. "Michael Johnson, thank you for speaking up." Evelyn smiled at Mr. Henderson, her eyes showing the same gratitude that Michael felt. "It's rare to see someone stand up like that. We appreciate it." Mr. Henderson smiled warmly. "No need to thank me. What's right is right, and I'll be damned if I sit here and let it go unnoticed." He turned back to the manager, whose face had turned pale. "I think it's time this restaurant revisits how it treats all of its patrons, don't you?" The manager stammered, clearly at a loss for words. "Ah yes, Mr. Henderson, of course. I'll make sure that happens immediately." Mr. Henderson gave a curt nod and returned to his table, but before sitting down, he waved over the waiter. "Bring a bottle of your best champagne to this table. On me." The waiter, still looking uncomfortable, nodded quickly and rushed off. The dynamic in the room had shifted. Michael could feel it. The stares were still there, but now they were tinged with curiosity and surprise. The whispering had increased, but it wasn't the same judgmental tone from earlier. Something had changed, and it was all because of Mr. Henderson's bold intervention. A surprising ally. A few moments later, the waiter returned with the champagne, carefully pouring it into crystal glasses for each member of the Johnson family. Michael accepted his glass, unsure of what to say. He glanced at Mr. Henderson, who simply raised his own glass in a quiet toast. "To dignity," Mr. Henderson said, his voice just loud enough for the Johnsons to hear. Michael nodded and raised his glass in return. "To dignity." As they took their first sips, the tension that had weighed so heavily on the evening began to dissipate. The staff, now aware of Mr. Henderson's influence, seemed to shift their attitudes. Suddenly, the waiter was attentive, making sure their table had everything they needed. The manager came by again, this time with a more sincere apology, offering to cover part of the meal. While Michael appreciated the change in service, he remained cautious. He knew this shift wasn't permanent. It was driven by the presence of someone with power, not a genuine change of heart. But for tonight, he was grateful. As the evening continued, the Johnson family began to relax, the tension lifting just a little. Lee giggled as she took tiny sips of sparkling water, pretending it was champagne. Jordan, though still quiet, seemed to be processing what had just happened, his anger softening into thoughtfulness. Michael, ever the pragmatist, knew this moment didn't erase the struggles they had faced, nor would it prevent future ones. But tonight, they had found an ally in an unexpected place. And that, at least, was a small victory, reflection and empowerment. The soft clinking of glasses echoed through the now subdued atmosphere of the restaurant. The Johnson family sat quietly, the initial tension easing, but the weight of the evening still hung in the air. The bottle of champagne sat at the center of the table, its golden liquid a symbol of the unexpected kindness they had received from Mr. Henderson, an act that had turned the night around. Michael took a slow sip from his glass, watching his children, Jordan and Leah, from across the table. He knew this moment required more than just enjoying their meal. It was a teaching opportunity, a chance to help his children understand the complexities of the world they lived in. He glanced at Evelyn, who gave him a knowing nod. Together, they had always made it a point to teach their children resilience, pride, and the importance of handling adversity with dignity. Tonight was no different, though the lesson was perhaps more poignant than ever. The family's discussion at the table. Michael placed his glass down and looked at Jordan, who was still quietly stewing, his eyes narrowed as he absent-mindedly picked at his food. The anger had softened, but it was still there, simmering just beneath the surface. "Son," Michael began, his voice calm but firm, "I know you're upset." Jordan looked up, his expression a mix of frustration and confusion. "Why didn't you do more, Dad? Why didn't you call them out earlier? That guy, Mr. Henderson, did more than we did." Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I understand why you feel that way. But let me tell you something, fighting every battle in the heat of the moment isn't always the best way to win. Sometimes, the greatest strength we have is in how we choose to respond. We stayed calm, we stayed together, and we didn't let their actions define who we are." Jordan frowned. "But it's not fair. They treated us like we didn't belong." Michael nodded. "You're right, it's not fair, and it won't always be. But that doesn't mean we give people the power to take away our dignity. If we had lashed out, if we had made a scene, it would have confirmed every assumption they had about us. But by staying calm, by handling it with grace, we showed them something they didn't expect." Evelyn chimed in, her voice gentle yet firm. "It's about teaching them that their opinions don't define us. We define ourselves." Jordan sat quietly for a moment, absorbing his parents' words. He still didn't like it, but he was beginning to understand. His father's approach, while frustrating in the moment, carried a strength that was deeper than the anger he felt. Leah, who had been listening quietly, furrowed her brow in confusion. "Why were they staring at us, Mommy? Did we do something wrong?" Evelyn's heart ached at the question. She reached across the table and took Leah's small hand in hers. "No, baby, we didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes people stare because they don't understand something. They might look at us and see something different, and that makes them uncomfortable. But just because they don't understand us doesn't mean we don't belong." Leah blinked, her innocent mind trying to make sense of it all. "So, they're scared of us because we look different." Evelyn smiled softly, though the weight of the conversation was heavy. "Not scared, exactly. More like confused. But what's important is that we know who we are, and we don't let their confusion change that." Michael added, "We walk into places like this because we belong here, just as much as anyone else. And one day, baby, you're going to do the same, and people will respect you for it." Leah nodded, still processing, but comforted by her parents' reassurances. The conversation hung in the air, a moment of deep reflection that each family member would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Other patrons start to take notice. As the family's conversation continued, the shift in the restaurant became more palpable. What had started as an atmosphere of judgment and exclusion was slowly evolving into something else entirely. Michael noticed that the stares, once filled with discomfort, were now softer, more curious than condescending. A few patrons exchanged glances with each other, as though reassessing their initial judgments. Before long, a couple seated at a nearby table stood up and approached the Johnsons. The woman, elegantly dressed in a designer gown, offered a small, apologetic smile. "I'm so sorry about how you've been treated tonight," she said softly. "It wasn't right, and I just wanted to let you know that we see you, and we respect you. It's not always easy, but you handled yourselves with such grace. Thank you for that." Michael, slightly taken aback, offered a polite smile. "Thank you. That means a lot." Her husband nodded in agreement. If it's any consolation, not everyone in here feels the same way as some of the others. You have more support than you think. They exchanged a few more kind words before returning to their table, leaving the Johnsons with a sense of vindication. What had started as a hostile environment was slowly turning into one of respect. The ripple effect of Mr. Henderson's intervention, coupled with the Johnsons' calm resolve, had begun to change the narrative. A broader social commentary. As the family continued their meal, Michael's mind wandered, reflecting on the deeper implications of the night. Despite all his success, despite everything he had achieved, moments like these reminded him that societal acceptance was still a fragile illusion. He had worked hard, climbed the ladder of success, but no matter how much money he made or how far he rose, there were still spaces where people would look at him and see only his skin color. It was a sobering reminder that for many, the rules were different. Social mobility wasn't always enough to escape the judgments that came with being black in America. Yet, that didn't diminish his pride in his accomplishments, nor did it take away from the importance of showing his children that they belonged. "We've come a long way, but there's still a lot further to go," Michael said quietly, almost to himself. Evelyn, ever perceptive, looked at her husband and nodded. "We've spent our whole lives preparing for moments like this, haven't we?" she said softly. Michael met her gaze. "Yes, we have. And now we're preparing our children for the same." Evelyn's eyes softened as she looked at Jordan and Leah. "It's hard, though, raising them in a world that might judge them before they even open their mouths. We've taught them to be strong, to be proud, but the world can be relentless. Still, we've got to give them the tools to navigate it with their heads held high." Michael nodded, his heart heavy but determined. And tonight, they learned one of the most important lessons: they belong anywhere they choose to be. The family fell into a comfortable silence, the conversation sinking in. It was more than just a meal. It was a moment of empowerment, a reminder that while the world might be slow to change, they could still stand tall and demand their space. A public act of kindness. As the evening wore on, the mood in Les Chateaux d'Or continued to shift. The once cold and judgmental atmosphere had slowly warmed, partly due to Mr. Henderson's bold intervention and the Johnson family's dignified composure. What had begun as a hostile dinner filled with microaggressions and discomfort was now evolving into something unexpected, a moment of transformation, not only for the Johnsons but for the patrons and staff as well. The family was finishing their meal when Mr. Henderson, the older gentleman who had earlier come to their defense, stood up once again. His tall figure approached their table with the same quiet confidence, and this time there was more than just support in his eyes. There was purpose. A bold move by Mr. Henderson. "Excuse me again, Mr. Johnson," Mr. Henderson said, his voice firm but warm. "I know we've already exchanged a few words tonight, but I'd like to speak with you about something more important." Michael looked up, surprised but intrigued. He motioned for Mr. Henderson to sit, which he did, gracefully lowering himself into an empty chair. "As you've probably guessed, I've been around for a long time," Mr. Henderson began. "I've seen my share of inequality and injustice, and though the world has changed in some ways, in others it's stayed the same. Nights like tonight remind me that we have a lot more work to do." Michael nodded, understanding exactly where he was coming from. "You're right about that." Mr. Henderson leaned in, his tone becoming more serious. "I've spent the last few years working on a project that's close to my heart, a charity organization focused on promoting inclusivity and social justice. It's something I believe is desperately needed, not just in places like this but everywhere. I've been looking for the right people to partner with, people who understand the importance of fighting for real change." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "That's why I'd like to invite you to join me in this effort. We need voices like yours, people who've experienced this firsthand, who know what it means to rise above the barriers society puts in front of them." Michael blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected the evening to take this kind of turn. He was grateful for the support Mr. Henderson had offered, but this was something entirely different. A partnership in a charity aimed at addressing the very issues they have faced tonight. "I don't know what to say," Michael replied, his voice thoughtful. "This is unexpected." Mr. Henderson smiled knowingly. Sometimes the most important opportunities come from the most unexpected places. I've watched how you've handled tonight. You and your family are the kind of people we need, people with grace, dignity, and the strength to inspire others. Michael glanced at Evelyn, who was smiling softly, pride evident in her eyes. She gave him a slight nod, her way of encouraging him to consider the offer. "I'd be honored to join you," Michael finally said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "This is exactly the kind of work we need to be doing." Mr. Henderson reached out to shake Michael's hand, sealing the partnership. "Then it's settled. We'll discuss the details later, but for now, just know that something good came out of this difficult night." The staff's genuine apology. Just as Mr. Henderson stood to leave, the restaurant manager and their waiter approached the table once again. This time, their expressions were different, no longer forced or uncomfortable, but genuinely remorseful. The manager, who had earlier offered a half-hearted apology, now seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. "Mr. Johnson, Mrs. Johnson," the manager began, his voice more sincere than before, "I want to apologize again, but this time, I want you to know that we understand how wrong tonight's treatment was. There's no excuse for it, and I take full responsibility for the way you were treated." The waiter, standing beside him, nodded, his face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm truly sorry, sir. I was wrong to make you feel unwelcome. That's not what this restaurant stands for, and I'll do better." Michael exchanged a glance with Evelyn, his expression thoughtful. He knew that apologies, while important, were just the first step. What mattered more was whether those apologies led to lasting change. "I appreciate the apology," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. "But it's not just about tonight. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again. Not to us, not to anyone." The manager nodded vigorously. "You're absolutely right, and we'll be taking steps to address that. We're going to implement new training for our staff, focusing on inclusivity and respect for all our patrons. This isn't just lip service, we mean it." Evelyn gave a slight smile, her eyes filled with quiet resolve. "We'll hold you to that." The manager smiled gratefully, clearly relieved that the conversation had taken a positive turn. "Thank you for your understanding. Please know that you and your family are always welcome here." With that, the manager and waiter departed, leaving the Johnson family to finish their meal in peace. The atmosphere around them had shifted once again, not just in the restaurant, but within the staff itself. Change, it seemed, had started to take root. The family leaves with pride. As the Johnson family stood up to leave, they walked through the restaurant with their heads held high, a quiet strength radiating from them. The stares they had received earlier, filled with judgment and discomfort, had now been replaced with something else: respect. Several diners, who had witnessed the evening unfold, gave them polite nods as they passed. Some even whispered words of encouragement, quietly acknowledging the impact the family had made without needing to say much at all. As they reached the door, Michael glanced back at the restaurant one last time. He could feel the shift, not just in the way people saw them, but in the atmosphere of the room itself. The evening had begun with tension and discomfort, but now, it felt as though a lesson had been learned. The Johnson family hadn't compromised their dignity or allowed the situation to push them away. Instead, they had faced it head-on and in doing so, had sparked a transformation. Leah tugged on Michael's hand, her voice full of curiosity. "Daddy, did we do something important tonight?" Michael smiled down at her, his heart swelling with pride. "Yes, sweetheart. We did something very important." As they stepped outside into the cool night air, the Johnson family walked away knowing that they had made a lasting impact on the restaurant, on the people who had watched the events unfold, and most importantly, on themselves. They had faced adversity and left with their heads held high, stronger for the experience. Together, they had proven that dignity, resilience, and grace could change even the most difficult situations, and they had done it without losing themselves in the process. The aftermath and a legacy. The days following their night at Le Château d'Or were filled with reflection for the Johnson family. The experience, initially fraught with tension and discomfort, had ultimately been transformative, both for them and for the people who had witnessed it. Sitting together in their living room the morning after, Michael and Evelyn watched their children play outside. The events of the previous night lingered in their minds, not as a moment of defeat, but as one of quiet triumph. A new beginning. Evelyn sipped her coffee, her eyes on Leah, who was running around the backyard, laughing with Jordan. She turned to Michael, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she began softly, "last night wasn't just about us. It was about our children, about showing them that they have a place in this world, no matter what anyone thinks." Michael nodded, his face serious but peaceful. "I've been thinking the same thing. It's easy to forget that every small moment we push through the barriers, we're not just doing it for ourselves. We're paving the way for them." Evelyn smiled, but there was a flicker of sadness in her eyes. "It shouldn't be this hard. Even after everything we've accomplished, we still have to prove ourselves, to remind the world that we belong." Michael reached over, taking her hand in his. "You're right, but that's why we keep pushing. For us, for them, and for everyone who'll come after. If we give up, we're letting them win." She squeezed his hand. "We'll never give up. Last night proved that." They sat in comfortable silence, both of them understanding that the night at the restaurant had marked a turning point, not just for their family, but for their personal resolve to continue challenging the systems that tried to hold them back. Michael's new partnership. A few weeks later, Michael found himself sitting in a downtown office with Mr. Henderson, the older gentleman who had come to their defense at the restaurant. The room was bright and minimalist, with large windows overlooking the city. Michael had agreed to join Mr. Henderson's charity project, a bold initiative aimed at promoting inclusivity and social justice, especially in spaces where people of color had long been marginalized. For Michael, this partnership wasn't just a new business venture, it was a chance to create lasting, meaningful change. "I'm glad you decided to come on board," Mr. Henderson said, leaning back in his chair. "With your experience and drive, I know we're going to make an impact." Michael nodded, his heart swelling with a sense of purpose. "This isn't just about what happened that night. It's about making sure people like my family, like so many others, don't have to keep facing the same obstacles." They spent the rest of the afternoon mapping out the organization's mission, building pathways to social and economic equality, educating communities, and holding businesses accountable for fostering truly inclusive environments. It felt like a fresh start, a new chapter in Michael's life where he could turn the frustrations and pain of the past into a force for progress. As he left the office that day, Michael felt lighter, more empowered. This partnership with Mr. Henderson had the potential to create ripples far beyond the walls of any restaurant or office. It could reach into the lives of countless people, helping them find their own paths to dignity and success. A ripple effect. In the weeks that followed, news of what had transpired at Le Chateau d'Or began to spread. Social media picked up the story, with patrons who had been at the restaurant that night recounting the moment Mr. Henderson stood up for the Johnsons. Bloggers, journalists, and local news outlets soon caught wind of the incident, and before long, it became a widely discussed topic. Public conversations about race, class, and inclusivity began to emerge, with the Johnson family becoming symbolic of quiet strength in the face of prejudice. People praised their grace and resilience, and the story sparked a broader conversation about how subtle acts of discrimination persist even in the most refined places. Michael and Evelyn found themselves at the center of these conversations, though they never sought the spotlight. To them, the importance wasn't in becoming public figures, but in what the story represented, a reminder that change often comes when people refuse to be silent. The Johnsons became examples of perseverance, symbols of how a simple act of holding one's head high could challenge deeply ingrained societal norms. Their story resonated with many who had experienced similar struggles, and it inspired others to speak out in their own lives, pushing for change in the spaces they occupied. Ending on a high note, months passed, and life for the Johnson family continued as it always had, busy, full of work, school, and the day-to-day routines that filled their time. But one evening, as Michael drove home from work, he found himself thinking back to that night at Le Chateau d'Or. "Let's go back," he said to Evelyn over dinner. "I think it's time." Evelyn smiled. She knew what he meant. "Let's do it." A week later, the Johnson family stepped out of their SUV and stood in front of the restaurant once again. The same familiar luxury cars lined the parking lot, and the soft glow from the chandeliers inside cast a warm light through the large windows. This time, though, something was different. As they walked through the doors, they were greeted with smiles, not the forced, uncomfortable kind they had received months ago, but genuine, welcoming ones. The hostess, a new face, greeted them warmly and seated them at one of the best tables in the restaurant. The manager, too, came by to say hello, his demeanor sincere and respectful. He informed them that the restaurant had taken significant steps to implement new diversity and inclusion policies, training programs for the staff, outreach to the local community, and partnerships with organizations that promoted equality. "We're proud of the changes we've made, thanks in part to your courage that night," the manager said. "You helped us see what needed to be fixed, and we've worked hard to make sure no one ever feels unwelcome here again." As the family settled into their seats, Michael felt a deep sense of fulfillment. They had returned, not in defiance, but in triumph. The restaurant had changed, the people had changed, and even though the journey was far from over, this moment felt like a victory. Leah giggled as she looked over the menu, her bright eyes scanning the unfamiliar dishes. "Daddy, can I get a fancy dessert this time?" Michael laughed, his heart light. "Of course, sweetheart." As the family shared a meal together, the atmosphere was entirely different. The restaurant that had once felt cold and unwelcoming now felt like a place where they belonged, not because anyone had granted them permission, but because they had claimed it for themselves. The story of the Johnson family, their quiet strength, and the ripples they had created in the world around them had left a lasting legacy. It wasn't just about one night at a restaurant, it was about perseverance, dignity, and the power of standing tall in the face of adversity. And as they left the restaurant that night, heads held high, they knew they had left their mark.